Maybe if everyone could find their seats. My name is Christopher Wild. I am the faculty director of the Parousia Program for Public Discourse. And it is my great honor to welcome you to this year's public thinking lecture organized and hosted by the Parousia Program for Public Discourse in collaboration with The Point magazine. And I want to, before I go on, also remind everyone, although you probably have seen an announcement, that there is tomorrow a small event for students from 12 to 2. If you have not already have other plans, and I hope that after this event you will sign up for tomorrow and you'll get a chance to, in a more intimate setting, talk to Rula and Itamar. Last year, we heard a thoughtful lecture by the noted journalist Elizabeth Bruenig on the limits of forgiveness. It seems to me that was a timely topic since then, and in particular after October 7th, we are in need of all the forgiveness we can give and get. In my introductory remarks last year, I cursorily reflected on the internal tension in the lecture series name of public thinking, that deep thought, the contemplative life, requires withdrawal from the hubbub of public life. And yet we're at a historical moment where public life and discourse is in great need of thoughtfulness, withholding judgment and listening what others have to say. Today's event, which is not so much to be a lecture, but a chamber music piece of different voices and experiences, we will plumb another contradictory pairing of terms, thought and activism. Historically, thought and action, the vita contemplativa and the vita activa, were thought to be mutually exclusive. If one is absorbed in thinking, one cannot act. If one is in the heat of action, there is no room for thought. And it seems like a truism that the political and social imaginary, particularly in this country, has always privileged the actors over the thinkers. And public discourse has contempt for the hesitation that comes from an engaged reflection. And yet it seems like another truism that at the present time, acting without thinking is in danger of being nothing more than reacting and thus incapable of changing the status quo. As the recent conflagrations concerning the conflict in the Middle East only serve to reinforce, we seem to have lost the ability to view public conversation as anything other than a zero-sum battle for political control, an arena for boosting social status, or an opportunity for a therapeutic self-expression. These reigning understandings of the point of public dialogue and of public life leave little room for the notion that we might benefit from coming together in order to think through our most basic problems and to expose ourselves, as Hannah Arendt has put it, to the truth inherent in the other's opinion. Our two guests today, Rula Daood and Itamar Avneri, from Standing Together, which will be introduced by John Baskin, founding editor from The Point magazine and co-organizer of this lecture series, demonstrate that thought and activism not only go together, but their joining is imperative to achieve real and transformative conversation and communication. They practice what the Parousia Program for Public Discourse strives to promote among students in the college: deliberation and dialogue across political, religious, ideological, racial divides, and do so under conditions that I hope our students will rarely encounter. I have nothing but the highest esteem and respect for the challenging work they're doing, and it is a great honor to host them at the University of Chicago today. Now please join me in welcoming John Baskin, who will introduce them now and moderate the Q&A later. John.
Thank you, Chris. So as Chris noted, the Program for Public Thinking is an outgrowth of The Point magazine, and that's sort of how I got involved in this work. I'm an editor at The Point. And after October 7th, we at The Point magazine, like many other magazines, really struggled to figure out what would be worth saying or publishing. With few reporting resources and little capacity to influence U.S. foreign policy directly, what could we offer our readers that would be worthwhile and that they weren't already getting elsewhere? One thing we knew we did not want to do was feed into the rapidly escalating culture war that was taking place at a lot of other Western publications and cultural institutions, not to mention on some college campuses. Debates about the environment for discourse at elite institutions are certainly not unimportant to us, but in those early days, we worried about the conversation becoming so insular as a real war was unfolding in Gaza. Meanwhile, one thing that seemed often to be missing from that conversation were the voices of activists and thinkers from the societies that were most directly impacted by the conflict. Luckily, one of our editors stumbled across a conversation posted online featuring two members of Standing Together. Standing Together is the largest Jewish-Palestinian movement for justice, equality, and peace in Israel and Palestine, and they had been organizing for these things long before October 7th. What stood out about the conversation, which we subsequently transcribed and published in the magazine, was that unlike some similar organizations that were splintering at the time, Standing Together activists seemed even more committed and disciplined in their approach to trying to build what they call the political will for an equitable, just, and peaceful future for the two peoples who were living in the region. Moreover, they seemed to be genuinely thoughtful about both the potential and the limitations of organizing and protest during a time of such acute crisis. For many of us, the conversation was the first to give us even a hint of hope. And I think you'll see why as you hear from Rula and Itamar today, who I'm very honored to now introduce. I was going to say something about thought and action, but I think Chris has done it. So Rula Daood is the national co-director of Standing Together and a speech pathologist by profession. She is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, born and raised in the Galilee village of Kafr Yasif. Rula began her activism in her home city and later became involved in promoting Jewish-Arab partnership in mixed, i.e. Jewish-Arab cities. Before joining Standing Together, Rula worked as a community organizer, organizing events and protests that drew hundreds of activists. Itamar Avneri is a social and peace activist and a community organizer. He is an elected city council representative of Tel Aviv Jaffa and one of the founding members of Standing Together. He is also a prominent voice in the LGBT community and a member of the Israeli Climate Forum. Itamar is a Ph.D. student, also a Ph.D. student in the history of science at Bar-Ilan University. So I'm going to turn it over to Rula and Itamar. They're going to come up and sit on these chairs, and they're each going to tell you a little about themselves and how they came to Standing Together, and then what the challenges and work of the organization have been since October 7th. After they finish speaking, I'll come up to ask them some follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up to you all for questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us and for having us and for coming. But can you hear me? Because I can't hear myself. So it's, yes, okay, great. We will be opening just with a bit more about who we are and how we've become partners in a movement that is rare to find now, which is a movement of both Jews and Palestinians, both living inside of the borders of Israel, inside of the Israeli society, and how our work have changed since the 7th of October. But I do want to open with maybe giving a bit of a background, because sometimes I feel that my story as a Palestinian citizen of Israel is missed by many, especially abroad. We've been here for a week and a half, I think, and in many times when I sit and I say I am a Palestinian citizen of Israel, some people do not understand how can I be also Palestinian and also a citizen of Israel. So my story goes back to 1948. When there was the war, which we call Nakba, catastrophe for the Palestinian people. Most of the Jewish society called it Independence Day, the becoming of Israel as a country. My grandparents tried to leave. Basically, they were thrown out of their villages. But from both sides, from my mom's side and my dad's side, we say we were the lucky ones. The ones who were able to come back to their homes. So I am not a refugee. I am not a refugee inside of my land. I was born in Kafr Yasif. I am a third generation to Nakba. And for most of us, today we are 21% of the population in Israel. 21% Palestinian citizens of Israel, and I am part of the Palestinian people. 4.5 million who live in the West Bank under military occupation by the Israeli government and military, and 2.2 who live in Gaza, who are now under bombings, in starvation, in diseases, and I think looking for some kind of a solution that will come and will help stop the ongoing war. My story began, I wasn't very young, because for most Palestinians, when you are a minority, you live in a place where you cannot be, you can't talk about politics. My parents lived through the martial laws, where basically Palestinians couldn't go out to demonstrate, were not allowed to say anything political under the Israeli regime. And for many of that generation, they lived in fear, in persecution. So they wanted their kids to not be persecuted. So for most of my generation, we are born in a very non-political homes. But being a minority means that when you meet with the majority and the hegemony in the society you live, you are reminded of what is your place in that society. And we face events of persecution, of injustice, of discrimination on a daily basis. When we go to the school, when we want to get a job, when I wanted to rent an apartment, and for me, the event that made the biggest impact on my life was when I finished my first degree and I wanted to travel. I had so many years I didn't go anywhere because it's really expensive to live in Israel also. So I had a little money saved, and when I finished my first degree, I am a speech therapist, I said I'm traveling to Italy. I just wanted to go to the beach, basically, and see maybe some similar people with a different language. And when I got to the airport, now for most of us, we understand that there's a different line of questioning for Palestinians and a different one for Jewish citizens of Israel. So I was in that line. They asked me to take off my shoes, take off my belt. I was asked where I'm going and why. And I thought that I was done. But before boarding to the airplane, I was taken to another questioning. And this time I was taken to a room with a security woman, and I was asked to strip off my clothes. And I was told that this is a random security check for my safety, for my own safety. And that was the first time, I think, that I felt that amount of humiliation. And I understood that if I'm going to say anything to the security woman, I'm just going to be crying, because I didn't really understand why am I going through this kind of a security check. I didn't do anything. I come from a very non-political home. I've never said anything. And all I want is just to travel for 3 weeks and come back. It was the first time I really realized how the country I live in sees me. And I was a threat. I was part of 21% of the population. And for the Israeli government, I was a threat. And I was supposed to be reminded of the place I have each and every day, even when I want to travel. I went, I had fun for 3 weeks, I did, I tried to. I came back, I started my career as a speech pathologist, and I started working in a clinic in Ashdod. And for those of you who do not know the geographics, Ashdod is at the south of Israel, and it's very close to the borders with Gaza. And in 2014, there was again another war between Israel and Hamas. And there were sirens, there were missiles coming from Gaza to the south of Israel, and there were also bombings, heavy bombings from Israel to Gaza. And when the siren stopped, we were allowed to go back to work. So I went to my clinic, Ashdod, and I did the same thing I do. I went to the same bakery I always go to buy something and to start my day. But that day, there was a newspaper in the bakery, and the newspaper had the faces of all of the kids who were killed by the Israeli bombings in 2014, and that week. And a woman who stood next to me looked at the newspaper and she just said, I hope they all die. Let them all burn, they deserve. And in these situations, as a minority, we usually don't speak up. I was the only Arab in that bakery, probably the only Arab in Ashdod, and it was a time of war, so I wasn't really sure if I can speak or say anything, but something hit me, that she looked at pictures of kids, and she wished for kids to die. And I answered her, I said, you know, you're right. They should all burn to death. And then me and you can go to the rooftop of this building and listen to the kids in Gaza scream while they are burned alive. And in that moment, there was silence in the bakery. Nobody said anything. And I think it was the first moment she understood what she really said, that she was wishing for kids to die. And in that moment, I understood that I didn't want to be a speech I didn't want to practice what I was practicing then, and I wanted to go into politics and into activism. And I wanted to take part in a movement or any political idea that can bring a change to the place I live in, while realizing that the society I live in is not a democratic society, has a very strong hegemony, which is the Jewish people who live in Israel and have citizenship. And the balance of powers are very different. I can be taken into questioning for writing anything or doing anything. Itamar, probably not. I probably won't get a permit to build a house if I have money back home. But Itamar, if he has money also, probably will be. But the difference is so huge in the society we live. And so I started looking for a political place. And the only place I met that understood the dynamics of the power, that we live in a society that believes in Jewish supremacy, was Standing Together. It was in a demonstration in 2017 in what we called, or what right-wing extremists call, Jerusalem Day. And basically it's a day where settlers come from the West Bank with the Israeli flags, and they just march in the streets of Jerusalem, of old Jerusalem, which has more than 90% of the population Palestinians who live under occupation. And they just want to provoke people and say, this is ours, not yours. So we were a bunch of lefties trying to basically have a demonstration against, to show that there's a different political agenda in our society. And a woman was there with this purple t-shirt, and it had written on it in Arabic and in Hebrew, Naqif Ma'an, Omdim Beyachad, which means standing together. And she just took a megaphone and she started shouting in Arabic and in Hebrew about justice, about ending the occupation, about real equality. And people started shouting back. And she shouted again, and people shouted back again in Arabic and in Hebrew. And that same woman just started marching to the streets of Jerusalem, not fearing the thousands of right-wing settlers. And everybody just followed. And that was the moment I understood that there is a political force in the society I live in that wants and demands change. And since then, I became an activist in Standing Together, which is a grassroots movement that organizes and mobilizes people within the Israeli society, both Jews and Palestinian, for issues of social justice, economic justice, environmental justice, also ending the military occupation on the West Bank, lifting the siege from Gaza, and really demanding and having an Israeli-Palestinian peace, an equal peace. And I believe in these principles, as Itamar does, because we also know that there is one simple fact from the place we come from. In our land that we both call home, in Israel, Palestine, two people live, the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. And none of us is going anywhere. No matter how many wars we will have, nobody will wake up to a day where somebody will just vanish. And it is about time to understand what do we need to do and what kind of steps do we need to take in order to bring the people living back home real safety, real independence, real equality, and feeling of having a home to prosper in. I will end it here and give it to you.
Thank you. Hi, hello everybody. Thank you, Rula. Thank you for having us. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for listening to us. Before I start, and I will tell you about how we founded Standing Together in 2015, but before I start, I just wanted to say we are here for a week and a half now. Yeah. For me, it's the first time since October 7 that I left the country, and it was a really hard decision to come, not to University of Chicago, to come to North America, because, you know, back home, there's war raging on Gaza for 5.5 months now. More than 30,000 people died in Gaza. 14,000 children died in Gaza. Why? For what? For whom? We're still waiting for more than 100 hostages to come back home. It seems like our government, the Israeli government, doesn't really care about them and about their lives. 70% of the buildings in Gaza are ruined or impacted by the Israeli bombings. Millions are displaced in Gaza, also in southern and northern Israel. And it's not only Gaza. Right now, at the occupied West Bank, Palestinians are facing the deadliest year in 2 decades, while violent settlers and Israeli soldiers doing their basically whatever they want. And we have ministers in our government, and I do apologize if what I'm about to say is triggering for you, but we have ministers who are sounding genocidal statements. They're talking about nuking Gaza. They're talking about expelling all of the Palestinians. They're talking about a second Nakba. And so it was hard for us to leave home, to leave all the other activists and members and Standing Together in other organizations and to come here. But we understand it's important to come also here, to share our story, but also to say it as explicitly as we can in English, just like we say it in Arabic and Hebrew in Israel, Palestine, back home. We demand an immediate ceasefire agreement that would stop the killing in Gaza, that would stop the starvation in Gaza, that would stop the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and would allow us to bring home the hostages. We demand to end the occupation, to lift the siege over Gaza, and then to move forward to a Israeli-Palestinian peace that would ensure all of us what we all deserve on the land, which is independence, freedom, justice, historical justice, dignity, safety, and the ability to plan and build a future. So this is what we are fighting for back home, and it's also very important for us to tell you that you also have a role in this fight. We have skin in the game, right? We're going home in a week and a half. We'll continue fighting there. But we also wanted to tell you that you should demand your government, the American administration, to stop with these blank check policies toward the Israeli government, to stop with the unconditional aid to the Israeli government. At the bare minimum, condition the aid to Israel right now, because right now what's going on in the ground is a crime, and it must stop. It must stop in order to save life. It must stop for Palestinians, and it's also terrible for Jewish people on the ground. And so you also have a role in this reality. So this is something that was very important for us to say. As I said before, we founded Standing Together in 2015, but actually I would like to start this story 4 years prior to that, in 2011. In 2011, we had in Israel the social protest. It was our version to Occupy Wall Street in the US, and the Arab Spring, of course, and the Indignados in Spain. And if you're taking into account the size of the population in Israel, it was the biggest of them all. In one night, we had 500,000 people marching in Tel Aviv. In American terms, it would be something like 23 million Americans marching on Chicago or in Washington or wherever. And the interesting thing was that we had this chant, this slogan that was actually took from the Tahrir Square in Egypt. They shouted there, "Ashai yurid iskat el midam." The people demand to overthrow the government, to overthrow the regime. we shouted, השייב יוריד עדאלה אג'תימאייה, העם דורש צדק חברתי. The people demand social justice. And I think for the first time in the history of Israel-Palestine, when we shouted, by the way, both in Hebrew and in Arabic, ha'am, השייב, the people, we didn't mean only the Jewish people. We didn't mean only the Palestinian people. We just meant the people. Everybody on the land that deserve the same rights. Now, I was a mere protester at the time. I had no role in the social protest. And I felt really lonely. I felt really lonely because although I was surrounded by tens of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of people sometimes, nobody approached me. Nobody asked me who I was, where I came, what's my name, whether I want to do something more in this protest. And indeed, we were the many, but we were not organized, and we lost terribly. Basically, the Israeli government and the Israeli prime minister, also back then Benjamin Netanyahu, completely disregarded our demands. And a few months after we started, or a few weeks after we started, we just found ourselves back home, alone, with no accomplishments to show. Many people left the country after that. But because I was always very political, I mean, at the age of 7, without knowing English, I was deeply invested in the presidential elections between Bush Sr., then President Bush, and Bill Clinton. I had many opinions about that. I was always very, very political. I understood it. I have to find a different way, a different lane if I want to engage in politics in my society. And so I went to volunteer in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. I volunteered in the chamber of MK Dov Hanin. Dov Hanin is a very well-known figure in the Israeli left. And there I met a few people who became very good friends of mine, but also some of them at least had roles in the social protest. And we used to speak about this protest and to say that maybe one day we will have an opportunity to do it a bit differently. And in politics, usually, unfortunately, opportunities come as a crisis. And in 2015, we had a terrible crisis. The Third Intifada broke out. It was called the Intifada of the Loneliness or the Intifada of the Knives. It was a terrible time in Palestine and Israel. Palestinians were afraid, Jews were afraid. There were attacks on the streets. There were lynches on the streets. And one day, our prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, went to the public, went to the press, and said, I am being asked whether we will always live by the sword. And the answer, he added, is yes. Think about it. He was being asked whether we will always live by the sword, whether we will always have this perpetual war, kill and be killed. And his answer, the elected leader of Israel, I never elected him, but the elected leader of Israel, his answer is yes. And what was even more terrible is that almost no one in the political sphere, in the political system in Israel, tried to challenge him and to say, what are you talking about? Yes, of course it's hard right now. Yes, of course it's not going to take us a week to achieve peace, but we have to keep on believing and fighting toward peace. And so we've decided that if no one is going to give us hope from above, we're going to build it from below. And a bunch of activists, basically Palestinians and Jewish, all citizens of Israel, whom we met in the Knesset, we decided that we are going to have a demonstration. We declared a demonstration in Jerusalem. We expected something like 300 people to come. Almost 3,000 people came. Then we had a demonstration in Haifa. Again, thousands came. Then we had a demonstration in the Triangle area, which is mostly Palestinian. Again, thousands came. We marched in the Negev. We marched in Tel Aviv. And people came and came and came. And with the lessons from 2011 on our mind, we understood that if we want to really build hope, it's not enough only to mobilize all those people. We have to also organize all these people. And so we've decided that we will try to build a movement. And with the slogan, the chant from 2011 in our mind, the people demand social justice, we decided this is going to be a people's grassroots movement, that its aim would be to build people's power in order for us to be able to achieve ending the occupation, peace and equality and environmental justice. And that movement came to be standing together, in Hebrew, Omdim Beyachad, in Arabic, Naqif Ma'an, and that's basically how we founded the movement. 2 years later, in 2017, the movement became also a democratic movement. So now people can join as members, they can elect the leadership of the movement, and that's also how Rula and I are part of the leadership of standing together. Yeah. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, and since then, our theory of change is very simple, actually. It speaks about what is mutual between the people and what kind of struggles do we lead to bring different communities together. But not just what kind of struggles to do that change, but also realizing that we do not start from the same point. Some communities have more advantage than the other communities. And the kind of politics we are trying to bring into the Israeli society, the society that we live in, is politics that understand that there is a hegemonic force that leads our society, and we demand to change that concept. So when we talk about changing the politics in the Israeli society, we're not talking about taking the middle ground, maintaining what we have right now. We're talking about a completely new ground, a one where citizens who live inside of Israel have real equality, have the same opportunities, and have real historical justice, but also understanding that there cannot be a way to live, to really live, once we have one nation occupying the other nation. So we understand that all of these subjects are related, and the fight, when we have one fight, it must, all of them basically, I'm English.
I don't know what you want to say.
Yeah, מחוברים אחד לשני.
You said it.
Yeah,
everything
connected. Yeah, everything is interconnected. Thank you. Sorry. Sometimes I forget my English is not good. And that is the thing we've been doing for the past 8 years. We've been mobilizing and organizing people. Today we have thousands of people in our movement. We have chapters in different places with activists, both Jews and Palestinian, working for these issues. We have approximately 11 chapters in campuses. We are the strongest political movement in the campuses back home, and we do organize students and we build new leaders. What we have seen in our society, what have happened since the 7th of October, is that the government, the Israeli government, is basically speaking of only one politics. They have, they know what they want, and the only thing they have been speaking of is occupying Gaza, resettling Gaza, and just throwing 2.2 million Palestinians from Gaza to go maybe to Egypt, but nobody really knows. And in the political atmosphere in Israel, as Itamar has said, nobody is really challenging that idea. And when nobody is challenging an idea, basically we're not giving people any alternatives. So what we are trying to do since the 7th of October is to build a political will inside of the society we live in, because we understand that the only ones that can make real change and real difference in Israel-Palestine are the people living in Israel-Palestine. So that is why we need to build a political will in our peoples to have that kind of change and demand that kind of change. Now, today, we're not the majority of the people in Israel, and we know that. But we are thousands and 10,000s of people who are working daily to bring a different voice, to put pressure on the politics that we are having right now, to make also the society we live in understand that we need change. The 7th of October made it very clear to many people that the status quo that was before couldn't be maintained anymore. And the only real question right now is, where do we go from here? What kind of politics do we have? What kind of leadership do we have? And a simple fact that we also realize is that this isn't the first war on Gaza or the first war between Israel and Hamas. It is actually the 14th. And each and every time we hear the same things by our politicians. Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, has said it again and again and again. He had said that Hamas is an asset. We need Hamas in Gaza. We need Hamas to stay stronger in order to prevent having an independent Palestinian state. So we do understand that we have two forces who kind of feed one another, and the only ones who are losing are the people living in Israel-Palestine. So we can affect the society we live in, the Israeli society. So our main work is inside the Israeli society to bring an alternative, a different voice in politics. And that is everything we've been doing actually since the 7th of October. If you want to...
Is this working?
Yeah, I can hear.
So thank you. And so we got a lot of background about standing together and coming up to October 7th, and you talked a little bit about what has been since then. I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more about sort of how October 7th changed your own conception of what you were doing, how it made your project harder in some ways, I would imagine, and also how within the organization you managed not to allow it to splinter at a time when there was so much pressure, I mean, even in America, much less where you were, for people to sort of choose a side and say, there's no way forward with this other group. How you feel your organization was able to move through that and address the country through it?
So I think we were able to do that because we do want to pick a side. And we think that everybody should pick a side, but we understand the sides maybe a bit differently. Every political project has to ask the same question. Who is us? Who is our political protagonist, right? Our answer is that us shouldn't be only the Jewish people or only the Palestinian people, and even doesn't have to be Jewish people standing in solidarity with Palestinians and Palestinians, cooperating with Jewish people inside Israel sometimes. We can really be a new protagonist together and to build a majority inside Israeli society that connects Jews and Palestinians, but also different communities inside, for example, the Jewish population. And so after October 7, I think it may be surprising, it may sound surprising, but it wasn't really hard to hold the movement because we immediately understood that our interests, even after October 7, lies on the same side. So this is one. Of course, it changed our trajectory. At September, we were about to launch our housing campaign. There's a huge housing crisis in Israel. And right now it's ridiculous to do that thing, right? And after October 7, we immediately understood that our main goal is to build this movement still, but that would fight in order to achieve a just and a real peace on the land. And so what we are trying to do since October 7 is basically three things. One is to mobilize people. As Rula said, right now, if you're going to Israel, you'll hear only one side, the side of the Israeli right, the side of the government, who are trying to persuade us that it's us versus them, that there is no such thing as an innocent Palestinian, that the children of today are the terrorists of tomorrow, that the children we didn't kill in 2014 are those who committed the attack on October 7, and that we hence must be ruthless. They try to persuade us that Palestinians inside Israel, citizens of Israel, are going to march any moment now on Jewish communities, Jewish neighborhoods, Jewish cities. And this is the almost only side that the Israeli society is hearing right now. So our first mission right now is just to mobilize people and to try to put another option on the table. This is one thing. But, as Rula said before, even if we'll manage to stop the war tomorrow, God willing, amen, nothing is going to change really, right? Because we just held another war in 1 year or 2 years, or who knows. So we also try to build the infrastructure for a real change. And so we still organizing people. We have 14 chapters around the country, 11 student chapters around the country, and our goal right now is that each and every day in every chapter around the country, people would be able to do something with us in order to further the cause of standing together. And the third thing, we understand and we recognize there is a lack of leadership in the Israeli peace camp. And so we opened a lot of leadership programs right now, especially in the campuses, especially with our students who are amazing and brilliant. And we try to give them the right tools and the right words and the understanding of the theory of change so they would be able to lead the Israeli peace camp and even lead the country one day. So that's basically three main things we're doing since October 7.
Can you say, or do you want to?
No,
Can you say a little more, just you mentioned the right tools, what kind of tools you're talking about, like grounding down into like when you do these workshops and you're trying particularly to prepare people to speak to Jewish citizens of Israel about sort of, you know, how people who may be very emotional or maybe very tied up with what the government is doing. I mean, there's a lot of support for the war in the country right now still. And so I'm curious, how you do help people have those conversations.
Well, we're community organizers. We talk about organizing. We work with communities by organizing them. Every event that we may have is an event not to just let people meet one another, but it has another agenda of basically politically educating people to what is the interest of the people living in this land. What do we really want to achieve and how can we achieve it? We speak about the real meaning of safety. What does safety mean to people? If we go back home right now, I think if you will ask people if they feel safe, most of them will tell you, no, we're not safe. So when we speak about real safety, we make it a point that the safety of the Jewish people living in Israel depends on the liberty and independence of the Palestinian people. And the same way, the independence of the Palestinian people is based on the safety of the Jewish people. And if we need to, in order to have that kind of safety, we need independence to the other part. And we talk about the past that we've had and we're still having and is still happening right now. Military action never gave us any other alternative. It always comes back to the same results. You have people who are killed, you have more hatred, you have more right people who become stronger with their ideas. So we educate people politically on what is the benefit of us. How do we benefit from bringing different politics to our communities and to our society? And we do that by organizing people. After the 7th of October, we were not allowed to go out and demonstrate. And there was actually many missiles coming from Gaza to the center. And even people were afraid to go out of their homes. But then again, the government and the police did not allow us to go out and do anything. We were not allowed to criticize the government for just retaliating against the Palestinians and killing thousands of innocent people. We were not allowed as Palestinians to say any kind of emotion about what was happening to our people in Gaza. And if we did, we were persecuted. And we couldn't really have a place to demonstrate. So what we did was we invited people to conventions in small gatherings in rooms. And despite all of the fear and the trauma, and because our government also said that people want to have violence, like people are out there, you should be, Itamar had said it, the Palestinian citizens want to kill all of the Jews inside of Israel. And when we called out for people to come to conventions, we were amazed to see thousands of people in our conventions, both Palestinians and Jewish people. And it gave us a simple message. It strengthened what we thought before, that in our society, in our community, people do want peace, do want safety, but they don't really have the alternative. Nobody is speaking that alternative, and they are organizing in one place to maybe build that alternative. So from having conventions, we went on to having demonstrations. and then on to having campaigns and demonstrations, and the campaigns we are leading do speak about that alternative, that we must have peace, Israeli-Palestinian peace, and it must start from having agreements, having negotiations in the place we live in.
Yeah, and I was always struck by the way the Standing Together people write and talk about appealing to the self-interest of the people they're talking to, as opposed to just sort of moral condemnation.
Because we do have self-interest in it. Jewish supremacy doesn't serve you. Of course, it's serving more than it serves Rula, okay? But when our government is talking about Jewish supremacy with the Jewish population in Israel, it's not real. It's a consolation prize. I mean, there's so much inequality in Israel. So many populations who are discriminated against. Jewish supremacy is a lie, basically. And I think that as Jewish people, we have to eradicate those kind of ideas. And this is really my self-interest, to live in a democratic, real democratic society, real equal society where everybody is equal. And so, yes, we do it out of solidarity, but also absolutely out of self-interest.
So we're here in Chicago on a college campus, and as you know, universities not only in Israel but here also have been very active and have had a lot of intense protests in America and across Europe as well. I was curious from your perspective how the international response has affected your own work, how it's helped or hindered it, and sort of what advice you might have for people who want to get involved with this from abroad.
We see social media the same as you do, and we see how people have become more radical through social media and with social media. And as Itamar had said it, at times of war, like, people pick a side, and we do want you to pick a side. But there's a big difference between picking the side of the governments and the leadership and picking the side of the people living there back home. Whether it's the Israeli government or the leadership of Hamas that is still in Gaza, both of these, powers are enemies of peace. Both of these powers had given up on their people in order to maintain their own power. And I want to give you a bit more information. Before the 7th of October, a survey was made in Gaza. People were asked if they believe in Hamas as a leadership. More than 70% of the people said that they do not want Hamas as a leadership. Hamas had become to power in 2007, and it was the same year that Israel had a siege and a blockage on Gaza. So since 2007 until this day, people in Gaza didn't have the right to choose another leadership, and they didn't really have the right to have any kind of elections. And back where we live, in Israel, in our society, what our government has been doing, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, is just giving more power to Hamas by leaving the blockage on Gaza and basically giving money to the Hamas regime and saying that Hamas is an asset and we need Hamas in order not to have an independent state of Palestine. We do understand that both of these powers are enemies of the people who live. So if you want to pick a side, also understand the facts that we live under. We want you to pick the side of the people living in Israel, Palestine, because both of us deserve to have freedom, equality, and liberty. It goes for both sides. And I think most of the work we are doing, because we do live in also a polarized society back home, there's no real left voices in the Israeli society. What we do, our main work, is not just condemning the reality and just shouting it, as loud as we can. We also want to change our reality. And that is why our main work is to reach out to the people who live with us, to try to convince and to really build that political power in people's minds to have a real change where we live. Because, again, as many efforts can be done from abroad, it's not like we're going to wake up someday and because somebody told the Israeli government, please end the occupation on the West Bank, and that occupation will end. It will not. It will end only if the people living back home, especially in the Israeli society, understand that it is in their interest to stop and end the occupation on the West Bank, to stop the bombing of Gaza, and to lift the siege from the people in Gaza. So that is what we do. That is our reality also.
I do want to add that, again, we said it before, we think you have a role.
You do.
We think you should help us in order to stop our government, stop what is going on right now on the ground. But as Rula said before, millions of Jewish people and millions of Palestinians are going nowhere. And the solution would only come from the people on the land. And so you should speak, you should protest, you should demand your governments to act. But if what you are doing here is going to compromise our work back home in building this political will inside our societies, then by all means, don't do it, okay? No, really, help us do our work, because it's also our moral obligation, right? Help us fight our government, demand your government to act, but don't interfere with our work, because if you compromise our work, I guess nothing will change.
Yeah. That's legitimate.
Okay, I think if I'm ready to, if people want to start asking some questions, I mean, I have more too, but but we can start taking some.
There's two mics, so
Yeah, Rachel, do you want to come up front here? We have one in the fourth row there.
Hi, my name is Martin Chapman. I'm a student in the college here. I was wondering if you, as a point of policy, supported Arab students or Arab citizens being required to do Shirut Leumi, national service.
If we support it?
Yes.
What do you mean by support?
If you believe that that would be something that would help integrate Arabs into Israeli society, decrease discrimination, or it would be something that's not right for them to do, hurtful. What is the...
Do you want us to answer, or you want to take
No, you can answer, yeah.
I think that in a democratic state, rights come without paying any deeds to the place you live in. So my answer would be that is no, because people are supposed to be born equal, and they do not have to live in a place where they are asked what they can do first to that government before the government asks itself what should we be doing to our people.
There's a lot.
Thank you. My name is Dara Grant. I teach in the college here. Thank you to both of you for this presentation, but also for the work that you do, which is impossibly difficult, especially at this time, but also obviously something that we all owe you a debt for. I have a question, though, about how easy it is to build a political bloc in the way that you're trying to do.
Can you hold it closer?
Sorry.
Yeah.
The question is, what room is there really in Israeli society today for maneuver of the kind that you're trying to pursue? What is the scope of action that is actually available under the current conditions? Because while I think that appealing to people's self-interest, meeting people where they are, this is obviously exactly the way you do the kind of work that you're doing. It's the only available way to do it. Mm-hmm. But it does feel, at least from outside, like the room for maneuver is incredibly narrow, and that the prospects of something like an emancipatory horizon, let alone stopping the killing, is relatively unavailable. And so I would like to hear what your view of where the point of pressure that is available to you is, to give people here a better sense of the kind of action they can pursue to support the work that you're doing.
Of course, we're not going to lie. Of course, it's very narrow right now. The majority of the Jewish population inside Israel moved to the right. In surveys that were conducted prior to October 7th, the majority of people, both in Israel and in the West Bank, said they would love Israeli-Palestinian peace, just really believe it's possible. And right now, of course, the majority, the overwhelming majority of people do not believe it's possible. But the slogan of the movement is, where there is struggle, there's hope. So we're not looking for hope and then we're trying to do something with it. We just keep on fighting, keep on working, and hence try to build hope and try to create hope. And there is hope. Hope lies with people, and there is hope on the land. I'll give you two examples. One, standing together, although for sure not the mainstream right now in Israeli society. Our name recognition right now is sky high, and we grew. A lot of people joined the movement. We had 4 student chapters prior to October 7. Now we have 11. So people do join. People do seek, do look for place to do stuff. And also, on the day of October 7, which was of course a terrible day, one of our biggest fears was that there's going to be also violence between Jews and Arabs in the big cities inside Israel. It happened before. It happened on May 2021 during another war on Gaza, the Guardian of the Walls war. And on that day, ministers like Itamar Avneri were already trying to incite this violence between Jews and Palestinians in the mixed cities. And what we tried to do immediately, and we did it really out of self-interest because we were really, really afraid, we formed solidarity guards, Jewish-Arab solidarity guards in mixed cities. We used our chapters, of course, to do that, but also just really quick, we contacted a lot of communities, a lot of local leaders, and started to work with them. And the idea was to de-escalate the atmosphere, to remind people that we have to live together, because we do live together. The future must be a shared future, and there's no room for violence. And you know what? Surprisingly, there was no violence. I mean, there was a little bit here and there, but there was no violence between Palestinians and Jewish people inside the mixed cities and inside Israel after October 7. For me, that's hope. For me, that's proof that there is room for maneuvering. And, you know, we're trying to build from that. And now to say to people, look, we already defeated Ben-Gvir once when he tried to incite this violence, and we prevented this violence. Now, let's defeat him again. And the Israeli population is becoming really angry at Benjamin Netanyahu and at the government. So this is another opening, and we are trying to be there and to widen the gap.
Hi, my name is Alan. I'm a fourth-year student here, and I just want to thank you again so much for sharing the amazing work you're doing today. Okay. So earlier, Mr. Avneri, you mentioned how there's almost an amplification of right-wing voices that maybe is not reflective of the perspectives of most of Israeli society. But earlier, Mr. Daoud, there was a story that you shared with us of you in the store and this woman with almost an insensitive nonchalance, you know, just saying how she wished that the children would all die. And so I wonder, in your experience, how do you see this sort of cognitive dissonance that's going on, manifesting in the public? And do you think there's a separation between public thoughts that people express, maybe because of social pressure, and then the actual private beliefs that they share? And if so, how do you imagine bringing forth those private beliefs if there is a rift between those and the public beliefs that maybe they're echoing those of leadership?
Well, I don't think it is a proof right now. Once you have war, once you live in a trauma that something really bad is happening to you, people become more radical. You become more radical. It is an instinctive thing to do. You kind of want to belong to your own people. You pick a side, you choose a side. And when given to that the politics of the place where you live are encouraging you to think that the other side, they're like no innocent people, you know, it makes it much stronger as a feeling that you should believe that everybody should die and you are the only one who have the right to live. And I think the lack of public pressure is there. It plays a very big role because that is what people hear all the time. They hear, like in Israel, if you go to Israel right now, you will see billboards in Israel, in towns and cities that say expel, how do you say? Occupy, expel, and resettle. Means expel all the people from Gaza, occupy Gaza, and resettle in Gaza. That is the kind of messaging that we have right now. And as long as people don't hear any other different message or see a different group of people doing something completely different, they will stick to the one opinion that they will have. And that is why one of the most important things to do, especially at this time, is to show that there is, another alternative, something else on this political menu. And that is what we are trying to do. And since we started it, I will give you a simple example. The 7th of October, when it happened, most people back home didn't really understand what was happening. The social media spoke about it all at the same day, but the mainstream media in Israel did not say anything about it, not even the government. And people living in Israel didn't know what really was happening. Everybody saw it just by the social media. And there was so much fear of what was happening. And when I opened my Instagram, I saw what was happening in Gaza. But when Itamar or somebody, from the Jewish community opened his Instagram, he saw what was happening in the south of Israel. And like completely different stories. And each one had, a different source of seeing what was really happening. And there's a great sense of fear that people will become more radical because we are not getting the whole picture, what was really happening. And everybody stuck to his side. But when we called for people to come to a convention, 4 days after the Hamas did attack and bombings were happening already in Gaza, hundreds of people came to the first convention. And what people did at the first convention is just kind of cry. Like, all people wanted to do is to understand that for the other side, there is mutual pain, mutual trauma. We are both afraid of what is to come or what is happening right now, and we need, kind of a validation that it is okay to have that kind of feeling. And we gave that to people. People gave it to one another. They had that shared space, an alternative space, not the one that they are hearing from the government, and it became more legal for them to feel something else, to understand that it is okay. You had stories from our activists at these conventions of people who lost their relatives because of the Hamas attack, because of the massacre. You had stories of people, activists, who had relatives being kidnapped and still in Gaza, held by Hamas. And you also had stories of activists who spoke about their relatives who have been killed by the bombings of Israel. So that space was very different for people from what we hear in mainstream media. And once you give people that place, you can overcome the ideas that, that kind of public pressure that's coming only from one side, and open it for different kind of feelings and give it more validation. So I think what I am trying to say is that we need to give people that shared space to understand that it is okay and that there is mutual pain and fear and stress. And only by doing that, you can really step to the next level, a level of, okay, so what do we do right now? But you do need to give it some kind of a validation.
That's just a quick follow-up. How did you create that space for people? I mean, especially at that moment, you have them come to a convention, but how did you allow people to feel they could talk about these things to each other?
It would have been impossible if we hadn't worked for 7 years before that. I mean, when we called people for conventions, they already knew who we are. Yeah. They knew they knew which side we're on, which is the side of the people. They knew they can trust us. They knew that we're not going to judge them if they're upset or even angry. They knew that if they don't want to come, we're not going to judge them. We're going to wait for them, and we're going to invite them again and again. And I think basically that's the only secret. It would have been impossible to do it after October 7 with a new movement. And that's why it's so important to organize people and to work with people, so we'll have the power to react when an emergency occurs, but also to try and change reality in order to prevent the next emergency. But really, that's the only answer.
Thanks. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation and the work that you do. I've been following you for the past couple of months. I'm Omdim. I'm a PhD student here. And my question has to do with, activism in times of what you might call polarization or wartime escalation. With that, there's an incitement of accusations about collaboration and treason, especially when it comes to more thoughtful interventions. Even the act of thinking could become a form of complicity or collaboration. So I wonder how you deal with those challenges, given that you're from two separate in-groups and that each in-group can kind of frame its own in-group members as traitors if they come to think or act in ways that the group doesn't want them to act in. So I just wish you would speak more about that.
Me? I was fine. I will say that these kind of accusations we don't get back home. First, because we are born...
Only for the government.
Yeah, only for the government. Only by the government. Like the government, because we're lefties, the government accuses us of being traitors. But by people, just, people, daily life people, we don't really get these accusations because we are born into a situation and a society where we have different facts. It is not called collaboration, it is just the society you are born into. You are born into a place where you have both Palestinians and Jews. We work together, we go to college together, we come back. Like, our life is very different from, the lives that we see here. And that is why that kind of polarization we don't have back home inside of the communities. It is something that the government uses to delegitimize what we are doing. I am trying to think of a good answer. It will take me some time because I need to basically bring my thoughts, but I will let Itamar start.
I would say inside the Jewish society in Israel, of course, that even before October 7, and of course that after October 7, people, at least there were some people, and also ministers in the government who they are calling us traitors, they're calling the Jewish members of Standing Together self-hating Jews, and stuff like that. And basically, we have two answers to them. The first answer, and I do apologize for my language, is fuck you. Okay, fuck you. And the second, the following, is that what we're doing, in my opinion, is the most patriotic thing to do, okay? And this is basically the answer. You don't agree with us, that's perfectly fine, but what we are doing is the most patriotic thing someone can do right now on the land, and we'll continue to do it even if you are trying to scare us. And by the way, after October 7, we had to flee our offices. Many of us, including Rula and myself, received death threats. We went to the police. The police told us, yeah, those are real death threats. Good luck with that. We're going to do nothing about it. We put cameras in the office, also in the house in the houses of some members. Some members in the leadership had to flee their houses because of the threats. But it was obvious for us all the time that even if they are trying to scare us, we're not going to stop. And basically, this is also the answer to them. You can threat us as long as you want. We are going to keep on doing what we're doing.
Yeah. I think also maybe because we do come from a different reality than the one that is, people hold to in here. And there's so much, I think, also disinformation about what is really happening back home and what are the forces who are playing in that political arena. But also, sometimes maybe just explaining that there are, simple facts, that things are not just black and white, that people who come from places where they have forces who oppress them live very different lives than the ones who come from total, independence and liberty and equality. And I think that is one of the cases in the Middle East, not just Israel, Palestine. Our reality is more complicated than just saying, black or white. Do I stand with these people or with those people? And I do think, and I do really believe in it, that real revolutionaries fight for the people, not for the governments. Fight for the people living in that situation, but not for just one idea.
Hi, thank you for thank you for coming, and also for sharing your experiences with the Israeli left. I think there's a common misconception, at least in the U.S., that there is no Israeli left in solidarity with Palestinians, so it's good to hear of your work. I do have a question, though, as a Jewish Voice for Peace member and as a former Students' Justice in Palestine member many, many years ago in college. There's a critique of Standing Together that Standing Together doesn't support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is the main form of activism in the United States to bring pressure upon the Israeli state. And so there's a feeling, at least among some members, of Jewish Voice for Peace. I can't really speak for Students' Justice in Palestine any longer, but I think it's sort of the same story, that we can't support Standing Together because Standing Together doesn't support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which seems a real tragedy because, of course, as you suggested, solidarity between peace activists in Israel, Palestine, and, of course, peace activists in the United States is very essential to changing American policy and also changing policy in Israel and Palestine. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts about, first of all, position on the BDS movement, but also, how to get these different groups kind of in dialogue with one another. Because, like I said, there is a seemingly large rupture between the sort of peace camp in the U.S. and the peace camp such as it exists in Israel, Palestine, if that question makes sense. Thank you.
There is, not the BDS movement, by the way, but group inside the BDS movement, PACB, called to boycott Standing Together. I would say, for sure they have good intents, really. And they're for Palestinian liberation, and we're for Palestinian liberation, and it's extremely important that people around the world would work toward this goal. I do feel it was really ill-advised, to say the least, to call to boycott a movement that is working within the Israeli society. I mean, you can't bypass the people on the land, right? So you can't bypass all the Jews and Palestinians who are living on the land, and it's, I think, a bad idea to try and boycott or bypass, at least, people who are working together in order to achieve peace, in order to end the occupation, in order to lift the blockade. And really, if you're boycotting parts of the Israeli peace camp, all that left is the Israeli government and the Israeli right, and that's only going to hurt Palestinian liberation. So I think it was really ill-advised. And you asked about our opinion about the BDS. I don't think we have an opinion about the BDS. I do think one of the forms of resistance, which is also legal, is to sanction people who are violent, and you can be sanctioning, and we do want the government to sanction settlers, violent settlers who live in the West Bank, and even sanction these settlers who are now ministers in the Israeli government, such as Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Please do sanction them. But there's a big difference between sanctions, having sanctions on people, on groups, on people who are trying to do something different, to fight, to change the status quo, and sanctioning people who have direct influence on what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza. And we should be able to make, that kind of differentiation, because true revolutionaries, people who believe in liberty, should not be boycotting other people who live under very bad circumstances, in inequality and under occupation. I think the bottom line is, of course, it's perfectly all right to call to boycott the Israeli government, but do not boycott societies. Yeah. I mean, when Donald Trump was the president of the US, you are not all the same, right? And you are not all the same as Donald Trump and his administration. That's exactly the same thing in every society with every government. pick a fight with the government and try to help the forces in the society that are trying to change things from within. I think that's the right theory of change. And that's it about it.
We have some questions up front, Rachel, if you want to.
Hello, my name is Desmond. I'm a student. I'm also a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Mm-hmm. So my question is about history and how standing together relates itself to the history of the Israeli or Palestinian left. Because there have been historically, a few at least, attempts to have Arab, Jewish, or Israeli-Palestinian unity. Mm-hmm. For instance, there was a Communist Party of Palestine in 1923, I believe. There was also, in the 60s, a group called Matzpen. And even very different contexts, but the 90s peace process, of course, not similar to the other groups, but there was a attempt, at least. There have been prior attempts to achieve what your project is attempting to achieve. So I'm just wondering, how does standing together relate itself to this history of past, frankly, failed attempts to accomplish this unity? How can a group, your project, succeed where history seems to leave quite a few left failures? Thank you.
So I would say we're trying to learn from whomever we can and from each attempt we can. We're trying to remind the society in Israel that there were attempts like that, and this is not a new or a radical idea. It was always part of the market of ideas in the Israeli society, but really, maybe it's going to be controversial, but if there is one movement that we are trying to learn from that worked in Israel, is from the right, the Bloc of the Faithful, Gush Emunim, they were called in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. After the war of 1967, Israel was never a real democracy, okay, don't get me wrong. It was more left-leaning in the early decades. And after the war, 1967, the settlement movement just started, and they were a minority. They were a really tiny minority, okay? Prime Minister back then, Yitzhak Rabin, he stood in the Knesset, and he called them cancer. 2 decades later, Kahana, the fascist Kahana, he was a MMK, a member of the Knesset, mm-hmm. and each time he spoke, you know what happened? 180 MKs, okay, members of the Knesset, just stood and went out. He was the only one left with the chairman who had to stay there, okay? But those groups, this movement, they kept on working. They organized people. They appealed to the self-interest of at least certain groups inside the Jewish society in Israel, and step by step, they changed the Israeli society, they changed Israeli politics, and they built a majority. And right now, it's obvious for all of us, right, that the Israeli society is really right-leaning. So actually, if we're trying to learn from someone, we're trying to learn from them, okay? We are going to do just the same. Right now, we are a minority, no doubt about that. But we are a fierce minority, and we are going to build a majority, and we are going to do it faster than them. I hope so. Yeah.
We just have time for a couple more, so if you could keep your questions short, that would be great, and we'll try to get in as many as...
Also our answers.
You answer. You're the stars.
So you mentioned in response to the 2011 demonstrations, basically, a ton of people were mobilized, but then the government basically did nothing about it, and it fizzled. So that seems like it's true of, or at least resonant to me with a lot of protests. You really get a lot of people out there, but the people in power just choose to do nothing about it. So what is the path you see from the work you're doing now to regime change and altering the future of Israel?
Can you speak up?
He's asking about that you mentioned in 2011 there were protests and nothing really changed. And so what's the path that you see? And this actually goes to something we talked about earlier about sort of the relationship between protest and organizing. Mm-hmm. in America right now, there's a lot of protesting, but I think it'd be interesting to hear you talk about sort of how you relate protests to the larger movement and what goes into that to actually create the kind of change you're trying for.
Yeah, so it's not just, making a change is not just by mobilizing people. If people go out to demonstrate week after week after week, there's that moment that you feel so much powerful because you're in the streets. But then when you go back home and you don't have any strategy of how to take all of that power and to put it in places that can make real change, you've basically failed. And that is what organizing people is all about. You have these moments of real power, of climax, then you have to know how to take people to your side, organize them, give them that kind of a political education, and then when another moment comes, you have more people going out to the streets, and then you can have more effect on what's happening. So that is one thing, by organizing people in the streets. The second thing I say is by making coalitions. If you are just one force, and that is one of the baddest, thing that the left has done for so many years, is that the left wants to be the righteous one, the one who says, all the right things in all the right sentences. And it's not about telling other people that that is the right thing to say. It is not. It's about building different coalitions and speaking to the interest of the people living. And it can be also by using different terminology that most people will not, accept. But that will build bridges and will build coalitions that maybe we didn't have before. And both of these things are things that we believe in and we do also in daily life back home. And by doing that, we've actually grown as a movement.
Hello. Thank you so much. This has been really inspiring, and I've been following your social media for a while, and something that has really caught my attention and in today's talk is how you changed the framing, from the leadership to the people and to the fact that you live together and will continue to do so. So how do you deal with that? But I wonder, because I hear from your discussion, that sounds to me like what has been said in other forums as a two-state solution. But I wanted to ask you whether that's what you're pointing to, or maybe you're agnostic about what a peaceful future will actually look like, and what you want to do is build the political will, or how do you deal with that, the kind of program for the future right now?
Thank you for the question, and I'm going to steal the description. Yes, we are agnostic toward the kind of solution. We are really not agnostic about the fundamentals of the solution. There are many possible solutions for the conflict: two-state solution, one-state solution, a confederation, what have you. We will support any solution as long as this solution will guarantee what we said before at the beginning: the independence, the freedom, the safety, the justice for all of us in the land. So we will support any solution as long as it will guarantee those fundamentals.
Yeah. Are we at time, Chris? One more.
Hi, my name's Talia. I'm a third-year undergrad. Thank you guys so much for coming. So kind of a related question. I was wondering what you guys are kind of demanding from the Israeli government now in this phase of the war in Gaza, and what you see as the current way forward. And kind of on a related note, and feel free to answer whichever part you guys would like, how do you actually meaningfully connect to advocacy groups on either extreme who are condemning what you guys do, either by virtue of the fact that you are standing together, Israelis and Arabs from the pro-Israel side, or, for example, from the BDS group calling to boycott you guys from the more pro-Palestine radical side. So sorry, to summarize. Yeah, sorry.
No, say it again.
Sorry, sorry. Again. So I'll summarize again. So what exactly are your demands right now in this war, and how do you see things moving forward from here? Okay. And also, how is your work how do you guys meaningfully and effectively connect to people on either extreme who are so quick to condemn you, like BDS was, and seem completely unwilling to hear you out?
Maybe I answer the first and you the second, or whatever. The immediate demands from the Israeli government is to reach a ceasefire agreement right now, to release the hostages right now, and then to resign, okay? Because they're complete failure, not only the failure of October 7, failure of policies for years right now. And the way forward, as we said before, we just have to build or rebuild the infrastructure of the Israeli left and the Israeli peace camp in the land, because without building this infrastructure anew, nothing is going to change. And we do acknowledge and recognize it's going to take time, but that's the only thing we can do.
Yeah, and for your second question is, I would answer that, first of all, we need to know to whom we are talking to. What are the people that we want to reach out to? And if you are talking to people who believe that from the river to the sea, only one people must stay, so they're not really your allies. You've been talking, these are not the one that you will succeed on preaching out to. But I think one of the main work that we are doing is just by bringing our story, by bringing our reality. In many times, movements who want to boycott us think it should be about black or white. They want us to say hashtag either I stand with Israel or hashtag I stand with Palestine. What we say is that we stand with the people living in Israel, Palestine, because both of these people deserve all of the principles that we have talked with. And in many times, you can't really, get to all of them. You also need to understand to whom are you speaking and which people you want beside you to continue that fight. And from my experience, also from talking to different communities in different places, I would say that the loudest one are the extremists, but the bigger portion of the people are within between, and they just want to reach out to something that can also sound, more reasonable for them. So social media may be doing right now so much damage to many people, but much of the work that needs to be done is not in social media. It is inside of rooms, of classrooms, within communities, with meetings like these where you can really reach out to people. I wouldn't take social media as the first thing to bring people together. I think it's the last thing, because it's making people more polarized, much more polarized.
Thank you so much. I think we're at time. Yeah. Clap. Yeah, you can clap. Before we all go, Rachel's staring at me. I know I'm supposed to deliver this message for any and all you Chicago undergrads or even graduate students. We'll be having a special student workshop tomorrow at noon with Rula and Itamar, and you can ask them any questions you didn't get to ask today, and speak directly about their work, maybe learn in even more detail how they set up these kinds of conversations. And it's also a place we can talk about other kinds of public thinking, journalism, how that's affected the movement, things like that. And so there are flyers in the outside about that and a QR code for you to sign up. We still have a few spots open, so please do that if you're interested. Yes. That'll be at noon tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, and lunch. If that wasn't enough for you.
Okay.